Welcome to the space between. This is where honest conversations live. Be prepared to explore the gap between what we say we do and what really drives growth, creativity, and change. Brought to you by MSQ. Visit msqindex.com to learn more. Join us now as we enter the space between.
Welcome everyone to another episode of The Space Between. I'm joined today by my co-host, as always, Deb Richardson. Hello,
Hi.
Deb.
Hi, darlings.
And we have our guest this morning, Manish Kapur. Hello, Manish. How are you?
Hello. I'm very
Great.
good, thank you. Very
Lovely
good.
to have you here. Now, Manish, you are an expert in agency operations. I mean, you live, breathe, and probably dream about agency operations. You've been sort of, kind of deep in agency operations for a long time. And that is your speciality. Can you tell us a little bit more about your career? What led you to become so immersed in agency operations, and why it is so important today?
Oh, thank you. That's a great little intro. So I've always been in the creative industry. I wasn't particularly academic, but I was quite creative. So I had ambitions to become a graphic designer. So when I left school, I went straight into college. I did a foundation course in print, and this is pre-Mac at the time. My tutor at the time said, look, there's so many people out there who want to be out there doing graphic design and designing record sleeves that you probably need to have a slightly different angle. And what he suggested was I did this foundation course in print first, print and typography, and then go on to do like a traditional BTEC and then eventually a degree in graphic design. It'll give you a slight edge. And so I thought, okay, I'll try that slightly different path. And so I started on this course. It was only 1 year. And the plan was to leave and then go on to do a BTEC in graphic design. But I got offered a job at book publishers. And so I thought, well, look, I'll try this out, see how it goes. At that time, they had these things called day release, which meant that you could work. And at the same time, they would allow you to go and do a day in college. So the idea was to do that and start off with doing the sort of the work experience and doing a day release. But at that time, there was this new piece of kit that was coming out, and it was an Apple Mac. And the guy at the time who owned this studio said, look, believe me, this is going to be the future. So it's in your interest to learn how to use it. And the people around me didn't want to be able to use this because they thought, forget it, it'll never take off. It's just a fad. This is another bit of kit. It won't. But I thought, look, I always wanted to learn this. We had only one Apple Mac when I was in college. To think that I had one for myself and not have to share it with 20, 30 students in itself was, a great opportunity. So I went in full on to learn it. And at that time, I was using it with a system called software called Quark Express, which kind of shows my age even more. But that gave me a real head start. So I started off working within studios, but I realized quite early on that I wasn't particularly creative in the sense I wasn't a good designer as my peers. There was a lot of other people that are better than me, and I never wanted to be mediocre in anything I ever do. But I was actually quite good at managing creatives. And so I realized that I was actually better at studio management than actually doing the work. And that's where my career really started to take off. So I was doing studio management roles. And eventually there was this thing called operations, which wasn't that common within agencies. But the last agency I worked at was a very large brand design agency. There was about 500 people across 5 international studios. So they required someone to look at how the actual agency worked beyond just looking at the studio side, which is predominantly resource management. And that's where I accelerated quite quickly, moving from the role of studio manager to creative services manager, head of creative services, eventually as executive operations director. And my role there was really to make sure that all the 5 studios functioned in the same way. And it worked so well that we could move designers from one office to the other. So there might be someone who's needed in New York. We have someone available in London. They would go across and they could literally sit at a desk and just start working because the whole ways of working were pretty consistent. Then things start to change. The agency was bought in 2017 by WPP, and I thought, okay, there's going to be a few changes. I'd also been doing this a long time, and it was that point where I thought, I'm not really developing. I don't know how much more I can learn. So I took the plunge in 2019 to go independent as a consultant. And I started off initially quite broad. I was an agency growth consultant because I thought that was quite unique. And then realized there's quite a few of us who are doing that. But I wasn't particularly successful with the sales cycle. That's nothing I'd ever done before. I thought, let me just stay in my lane and focus on what I'm really good at, which is around agency operations. So I've been doing this now for the last, 7 years. But what I've found is that because I focus on this and I work with plenty of agencies and very different types of agencies, there could be a design agency, an ad agency, marketing, social, SEO, that my knowledge around operations has actually got a lot deeper because I'm getting experience from a multiple different type of agencies, different types of problems. Of course, there's a commonality there as far as what issues they've currently got, but ultimately they all have the same problems and I can normally solve it. But because I'm working with such a variety of agencies, my knowledge has become a lot deeper. And I never claim to be the smartest guy in the room. I've got a certain knowledge, but I learn off the people that I work with. And I think this is the difference now is when I started out, there wasn't really an operations role. But most agencies, when they get to a certain size, realize the importance of bringing someone in who can actually help run the business and make sure that it's delivering the best work on time and to budget. And so in the past, there wouldn't be any people doing it. Now, most agencies have someone doing that role. They may not be called an operations manager, but they exist to make sure the agency is running as efficiently as possible.
Amazing. Well, that's an amazing overview, Manish. So thank you so much for that. And you touched then on there why agencies bring you in. But I mean, obviously, apart from efficiency, there are other benefits. I mean, cost benefits as well. So is that a primary driver or a secondary driver for agencies?
Yeah, well, I think I could be called into it. So most agencies I work with don't have a sales problem. Their pipeline is pretty full. And so they'll get to a point where they'll go, well, actually, we've got a lot of work, but we're not particularly profitable. And I think there's a sort of an assumption that as you grow, you automatically become profitable. And that's not the case. In fact, what tends to happen is that you take on more overhead. The gut reaction for agencies is to hire more people. Oh, we've got more work, we need more people. But that's just stepping back and going, well, are we using the people that we've got in the most effective way? So I'll be called in when they look at it and go, well, our turnover's increased. We're actually a lot bigger than we were, but we're not as profitable. Why is that? Or it could be that actually they've been going for a good 5 years and growth is just stalled. One year they grow, next year they shrink, another year they grow, next year they shrink. And they just can't work out why they can't break a certain barrier. So they might be on a certain level of turnover and they've been on that for the last 3 or 4 years and they can't work out why that is. And I'll go in and assess that agency top to toe and work out what's working and what's not and then help them.
Okay, and then in terms of what you see mostly in agencies, in terms of the problems that they face, from when you started your consultancy to today, is that changing, or is it still the same problems? I mean, or is it predominantly? I'm going to mention it. AI as the big efficiency driver is that agencies want to understand that.
Yeah, well, I would say in the last 7 years, it's been a tough time for all agencies. It's been a real mixed bag. Some agencies are doing okay and others not doing so well. And I think it's been a tough period. And I think in general, I don't think there's the same level of confidence that's out there. And it hasn't been for a while. No one's really saying, I'm going to start this year and we're going to absolutely smash it. They're optimistic that they will do, but there's more of a cautious approach. So it makes it more challenging. And I think because of that, agencies, particularly when it comes to consultants, tend to hold back a little bit. And of course, some of them have been burnt, and I understand why. They brought someone in, they've paid a lot of money, and they've not had the impact. So they tend to be a lot more cautious. When someone comes to approach me, they've had the problem for at least 6 months.
Right.
At least 6 months. They've initially ignored it, and then they try to fix it themselves, and eventually they've contacted me. I would love to be in a position where someone says, actually, we've spotted an issue. Could you come and sort this now? It just doesn't happen.
Manish,
They will literally try and ignore it and try and fix it themselves first.
Manish, you talked about over the last 7 years, it's been tough. And again, we haven't had the AI thing for 7 years. So, well, why do you think as a sector it has been tough? So there's like I mean, we've only really been talking about AI in the way we have for a couple of years, I would say.
Well, I think the budgets are always an issue. And I think we've got to understand is that it starts from the client's end first. And when they're being squeezed, then agencies get squeezed. And sometimes the work doesn't come through, not because there isn't a budget, is that there isn't anyone there to actually give the brief. Because if the marketing team are being squeezed and their numbers are being cut, and we see this all the time, a big corporation loses money in sales, the first thing you do is cut their marketing, when we all know, in fact, you should be emphasizing building it, but they'll cut the marketing team. So you end up with a scenario where you've got a marketing team that's hugely challenged. They've got a lot on their plate. And I remember seeing, a pie chart that someone had done that worked for a very large FMCG. And what they were showing was what is their day in their life? Where did they spend their time? And the shocking thing was that when it came to actually marketing, as in working with their creative agencies, it was a tiny percent. It was like 15%. They had a load of stuff about admin, trying to sell things internally. There's a whole host of stuff that they had on their plate versus what they did as far as agencies. And I think agencies think that when you work with a marketing person, that they are there 100% to work with the agency to deliver a creative piece of work. And we know that's not the case. And I think if the clients are struggling, as in the overall companies are struggling, and they make cutbacks, and then they cut back on the marketing team, there's less people to do the work. That means the work can't filter down to the agencies. But at the same time, if they're having a cost-cutting exercise, they will look at all their suppliers. And I think the problem is agencies are very quick to cut their costs. That's the worst thing they can do. They'll cut their costs. They're like, okay, we can do that for 20% cheaper, hoping they'll make it up for the next job. Of course, they never do.
I think it's like from my perspective, when I was in my last corporate role, we had a very small team and a relatively large budget. And it just goes back to what you were saying about, the brief. Like quite often, that was what I chose. I chose to have a small internal team and a large external team. And actually what I really wanted and what I ended up finding were agencies that came to me with ideas rather than some of the agencies that just sat there waiting for what's the brief. And I think you've got to get to know your client, because certainly, the agencies that were most successful with me understood we had a relatively large budget for, but we also had a really small team, and it was their opportunity to take. And I think that, to your point, they're just waiting for the brief, and the client just isn't always in a position to do that, whether it's a time, experience, size perspective. So I think you're spot on. Agencies need to be a bit more proactive from going to the client.
Absolutely. And I think this has come a lot in benchmark reports. And you all know Remini, she produces a great survey every year. And one of the things she highlighted in her report is the fact that clients want their agency to be a lot more strategic. And that's not necessarily about the strategic as in the work they're delivering for the client, but just understand the client's business more, and to go to them with opportunities and say, look, I've spotted something. I think this would help you. If we could work together on this and show a little bit more initiative by actually creating the brief in the first place. And you're right, most of them just sit back and wait and then complain that the brief.
Why do you think that is, Manish? I mean, do you feel that's a sort of confidence issue on the part of agencies?
100%. It is. I think it is. I think they still feel they've got this very kind of sort of supplier mentality.
Yeah.
And I think, the best agencies really feel that they're the client's partner. And that takes the right kind of skill set. And I think strategists in particular can do this well. My last agency, we grew the strategy department quite a bit. There was about 15 strategists. And the reason is that we realized that we could get our seat on the top table, which meant that the client would call us in to discuss all sorts of challenges that didn't necessarily result in a brief that was going to come to the agency that I worked with. They would say, look, we've got an advertising problem, we've got a marketing problem, we've got whatever it might be. But because they valued the input of our strategists, and because they thought a lot broader, they would actually ask them to come in and talk about projects that were never going to come to us. But that allowed the client to gain trust in our strategists and to hear them out. And it meant that we could also understand and hear their problems and go back with initiatives and say, look, we've got a problem in this area. We think we could do a piece of work that actually would help. And that was a value. And because the marketing teams were so stretched, they actually appreciated the initiative that the agency was showing and the willingness to go back. But I totally agree with you, Seth. It's about confidence. It's about confidence in saying, actually, we know what's right for you as a client. This is what we think would help, and be willing to pitch that to them and not just wait for a brief to land on your desk.
Yeah, and I think you're so right there. I think absolutely spot on in terms of that confidence thing. And I mean, it's, agencies are not without talent. I mean, they're full of talented, incredible people. But one of the issues, unfortunately, is that they're not bringing in new talent because of this efficiency play that AI is introducing. So do you see a problem there for agencies in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we don't talk about this enough. This is a real problem. And I think we talk about people who are currently in agencies that are unfortunately are losing their jobs, but we don't talk enough about the new talent that we need to bring in to keep the agencies fresh. The fact is that when you talk about AI, people are normally reducing their workload by getting rid of maybe admin tasks, junior
Yes.
type tasks. And where in the past you would have had someone junior helping with that and then learning on the job and growing with experience, if you don't have those tasks, you're more reluctant to actually bring in the talent because you wonder what you're going to do with them and how you're going to keep them busy. And I think with AI becoming more and more prevalent and taking away some of those more basic tasks, I think agencies have to be a lot more, willing and to think about the future of the agencies, not just their own, but the industry as a whole, and be committed to finding that talent and find other things for them to work on and give them proper training on the actual job, which may involve them being less chargeable, if at all, but understanding that in the long run, it'll work out for them. But in the past, let's say, for instance, you might bring in an account exec to help the client servicing team. They would spend quite a bit of their time in a meeting taking notes. That wouldn't happen so much now because we'd have a note taker. Now, I'm not saying that's all they do. Of course, they have lots of value. I'm just using that as one example. But then you may look at they might help with scoping. But once again, you could automate that process. And I think we run the risk of where we might start to use AI and automation, where those lower level tasks go. And then agencies are like, well, instead of bringing 2 or 3 juniors, maybe we just bring in the one.
Yes.
And the industry already has been tough to get into, particularly for creatives. There's a ton of creatives out there all looking for jobs. And the challenge is they're not going to be given the opportunities because agencies are like, well, I don't know how I'm going to utilize them. And of course, we don't want a whole load of people that are being underutilized. But I think in some respects, agencies have got to go, well, we need to grow our own. We need to build for the future. And we need to think of them in a different way, which is about training them up for the job they will be doing and not just picking up some of the more basic tasks.
Yeah. And I guess there's a dual challenge as well in that, obviously clients have a vested interest in agencies being seen as suppliers sometimes because then they can push them on price. If AI is introducing that efficiency play, the client can obviously suggest that they shouldn't pay the rates that they were paying. So the challenge for an agency is to find that path where they can offer more value to the client. So we talk about it all the time. It's that the value is in the thinking, and agencies are really good at that, but they haven't been very good at extracting kind of revenue value from it. So do you think that agencies are going to change in that regard as well?
100%, and they're going to have to. Anything towards the execution end will go.
Yeah.
Now, that's where the new tech is going to have the impact. So anything executional will go. Either it'll get automated or it'll get offshored. It's not something that an agency will keep because they won't be able to compete on price. It gets commoditized. Where agencies need to be is at the top end, the more strategic end, and it down to all the thinking, because that's where they can protect the value that they offer and actually show clients this is why you need us, and it can't be replicated with technology is easy. And I think if you're an agency at the moment that relies heavily on the executional end, you need to find ways of becoming a lot more strategic because that will just go. It doesn't need the human element within there. And I've seen it already, in the fields of packaging design, which is my background. We used to have a whole team of art workers. There's very few that actually agencies have them. That role itself is becoming, none and void because that can either be offshored or it is getting to a point that it can start to be automated. And I've seen the technology where you don't even need an art worker to create it. And it's a shame because there's a whole load of people with huge amounts of talent. But anyone that's running on the executional side of agency is going to have a problem. You need to be more upfront. You need to be more strategic and actually demonstrate, well, this is why we have talent instead of just technology to be delivered this work for you.
And what do you think is happening on the client side? I mean, in terms of in-housing for agencies, and the fact that they can actually do a lot of the things that the agency used to do. That's a challenge as well for agencies. Do you feel?
Absolutely. Well, look, it used to be that in-house was seen as sort of like the second tier.
Yes.
If you couldn't make it within agencies, you worked within in-house.
Yeah.
That's certainly not the case now. I don't know of any large brand corporation that doesn't have some form of in-house setup. And it's no longer settled. They attract the top talent and they're doing some amazing work. The challenge we've got is with agencies already being squeezed, If clients then think, well, actually, it's much, much more cost effective for us to bring that in-house, it puts more pressure on the agencies to reduce their costs. But it can't be helped. And I think this is where agencies have to show the value that they can offer above and beyond an in-house setup. So most companies that have an in-house setup tend to start on a more of a basic level.
Yeah.
So they might end up doing some more implementation type work. They might end up doing some social work, whatever. But they're still using top-tier ad agencies to do their TV ads, for instance. And I know quite a few in-house teams that do quite a bit of the work in-house, but that kind of what is traditionally called as above the line is still being done by
or
an
to
agency.
do their thinking is the, the strategy stuff. But
Absolutely.
I mean, but so are you sort of optimistic about agencies in the future, or are you sort of a glass half empty on this? I
What do
mean,
you think? What do you think an agency is
Well,
going to look like?
Yeah.
The three of us have been in a room together a few times recently, and one of them was when you were on a panel at the Productive half-day conference in London. And in that on that panel, in that session, they were talking about agencies have got to get through this efficiency stage of using AI and get onto how do you use AI for growth, which I thought was we're going to move there, I hope. But for me, I'd love to know what on that note, what do you think an agency is going to look like 3 years down the track? And anything from how many do you think are going to be in the UK? What do you think they're going to look like? Just give us the world according to Manish.
Well, I think first of all, we need to change our thinking around AI. It's a tool. It's a little bit of tech. And for people like myself that went through the period of where things were done traditionally by hands, like paste up boards and all that kind of stuff, and onto Macs, there were a ton of people that lost their jobs because Apple Macs came into play. And so we're going through a similar sort of shift. Now, things are moving a lot faster than they did then, but we're going through a different shift to where we're having a change of technology and change of tools. But ultimately, it's still a talent business. Now, my view on it, if you're a mediocre agency, then you've pretty much had it. Because what you're doing in a sort of mediocre level will get replaced because someone can duplicate that. But if you're very good at what you do and you truly have talent, you've got nothing to worry about. Because all you're going to do is leverage a tool to make the work that you do better and to give yourself more thinking time. So let's take an example of a strategist that might take a day just reading through a load of documents and then do their thinking. Now they can get that document stuff read within hours by using the technology. Something like NoLM will create a podcast of a load of material that you can get that into your head a lot quicker. So you can get onto the thinking a lot quicker. So you're not reliant on having to go through a load of materials. Designers who want to try out ideas quickly can do that a lot quicker by just a series of prompts. But we talk about the AI sandwich. I think this is really important. Is ultimately we know that to get the best out of the tools is to give it a really good prompt. It all starts from the prompt. If your prompt is bad, the output's going to be bad. The human has got to give that prompt, right? The human has got to say, this is what I want, and feed it the right information. AI will give its bit in the middle of, this is what I think you want. But ultimately, it's about the judgment. It's about the judgment of the human to go, is this good or is this not good? I could hammer ChatGPT and say, this isn't right. It'll say, sorry, let me work on it. It's not right. And I'll keep going until I get to a point where I say, I'm happy with what you've actually produced. It's still the human judgment. And I think at the moment, we worry that technology is coming and is going to take over the industry. And I hear this all the time. Claude has got a design element to it now. So people are saying agencies are dead. Absolutely. If you are rubbish, if you are crap, if you are mediocre, you are absolutely gone,
Dead in the
finished,
water.
finito. You haven't got an opportunity. But if you're truly talented, you have nothing to worry about. And in fact, you should be excited that, in fact, you're going to have more thinking time because you're going to have the technology that can do the doing for you. You can experiment much, much quicker than you ever did before because you have the tech. And I think, yes, it will reduce the industry. I've no doubt about it. When Max came in, a lot of people were out of jobs and the industry shrunk. And unfortunately, I think it's going to happen again with AI. But ultimately, it's a talent business. And what this will do is sift through the people that are truly talented versus the people that are mediocre. And I think that's where the change is going to happen. What we'll end up with is higher quality agencies. If you are an agency that's not in-house, that's running independently, the chances are that you are absolutely the best. And it will get rid of all the mediocrity that's out there because you won't be able to survive if you're just media. And I think ultimately, if you're good at what you do and you're really talented, embrace it. because this is your best friend. It's going to allow you to do your best work far more than you've ever done before, and you shouldn't fear it.
Feel that that's marvelously optimistic and positive for
Yeah.
agencies. So thank you for that, Manish.
And I think that, you know, we're speaking to agency people all of the time on both sides of the, you know, in Australia, in Asia Pac, and here, and there's this level of desire to be optimistic, and we have to grab it. People like us have to take it and turn it into all of the positives we know that this sector has. And I think for me, I am going to ask the AI question now, because I keep hearing stats here, there, and everywhere. And again, this was your topic on the panel. It's like, okay, let's assume we're not going to be fearful. Let's assume it's going to be a tool for the positive. Where the hell do they start? You know, you're as you know, a super fueled ops guy, and you go into an agency. What's your advice around, you know, where do they get going? Because they talk of, you know, we're not adopting it as agencies. There's 5 to 10%. It feels like the Wild West out there. How do you help your agencies get their heads around what's in front of them?
Yeah, well, I think you start off small. I think agencies feel the pressure that overnight they're going to become an AI first agency, and you don't. What you're looking at is some of the more smaller tasks that you look at and think, well, could this be done by AI or could it be automated? And I think, first of all, I would say I see those two separate things. There's AI and there's automation. They're two separate things. And I think agencies can benefit from both, but I would say start off small. So we've already talked about things like a note taker, for instance, as a starting point. But look at the task that you're doing at the moment and think, well, is this really the most efficient way that we're working? Or could, in fact, we use technology to do it a lot faster? And a lot of the new systems out there, and we mentioned Productive because that's the panel I was on, but that as one example has automation built in. So they look at it and go, well, this is your workflow. And in fact, we've got a setup there that you could actually use to automate this. And they've actually added to that where you can now give it a prompt, and the AI that's going to be built into the system will create the workflow for you. And I think agencies have got to start off quite small, find out what are the kind of menial tasks they're doing at the moment that they could leverage AI and start to use that. And there's things like the note takers as an example. There's tools out there that will help you allocate resource. You know, look at the skill sets that are currently out there within your team versus the type of work, and give you a first draft of how you could allocate the work. So look at the more admin-based things and start off from there. One thing I'll say that's really difficult for agencies is that traditionally, when we had a bit of technology or software, it was more about learning the updates. So let's say a creative studio might have a Mac, it might have InDesign, it might have Photoshop. Those were like the standard. So all you had to do as a creative was just make sure that you kept up to speed with the updates. So every so often they will release an update, and then you'll go, okay, great, and then you'll learn the new features that it's got, and that's what you got to know. So you'd go into an agency and you'd be expected to be able to know Photoshop and InDesign as an example. The problem we've got with AI is that the tools are changing all the time. So agencies get stuck because they're like, well, what do I go for? It's like, you know, I was using this and now I'm being told to use that. And then they freeze. And then they're waiting for this perfect moment of where it becomes an industry standard of some kind of tool. And that's the difference between now and then, is that will never happen. What you're going to end up having is a scenario where you go, look, we are going to use this tool to do a particular task. We've recognized that this task needs to be done by using some form of AI. The way that we approach it is we say, well, we're using this particular tool because that's really good. Let's say for note taking, we use Otter. And then we go down and 6 months down the line, we realize actually Fireflies is better than Otter because they've added some new features. The key is to spot that and to make sure you're consistent as an agency. Because the other thing I find is that because there's no consistency, everyone uses their own tool. So it's not unusual for me to find an agency using 3 or 4 different note takers. Everyone's got their own version. What the agency does need to do is decide on what it's going to use and start to adopt that, but then accept that things move on, technology is moving at a pace, and is 6 months down the line, if there's new features within that, then use it and move and be acceptable that you have to be agile in your thinking and adopt new technology. So at the moment, I will say things like Claude, for instance, where it's got an actual physical card, which is a phenomenal piece of technology in itself. It's got a card that you can literally stick to the back of your phone, and it's phenomenal as far as how it can
Got
record
mine as well.
conversations. Yeah, it's phenomenal. So if someone said to me right here and now, what should we be using? I said, you've got to look into Claude because it can record conversation. Of course, you ask permission. You're not just going to record in stealth mode. But that's where technology is moving so quickly that you just have to accept we're not going to stop using AI. We're going to approach this with an agile mentality that we're using this now. If it's still fit for purpose in 6 months, we continue to use it. If it's not, we'll swap it out and we're going to try another bit of tech. And that's the difference I think agencies need to have in their thinking.
That's it. That's interesting. But you know, going back to those early days of being a Mac user, the whole premise of Mac, and I remember this from when I was working in newspapers. We were selling out. I was selling ad space to the agency, and they used to refer to an individual in an organization becoming the first user of the Mac and becoming the Mac champion for that organization. And I feel that is sort of a similar thing that we're in at the moment, that individuals become the champions and sort of agencies haven't sort of, as you say, haven't stepped up and had a process or a policy on AI use or AI products, and I feel that agencies are always going to be full of those people, that they always are going to be early adopters as individuals. So it's quite difficult, I feel, for an agency to kind of manage that, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting because some people say, well, do we need to have an individual that is like an internal champion? And I remember seeing an ad for an agency that I know quite well, and they're probably around about 50 people, where they actually advertise for someone to come in and become that champion. And I think, yes, you do need someone who's kind of taking a bit of a lead to monitor what's going on, to make sure there's a bit of an AI policy, because we've got this whole thing around IP, which is a whole other separate conversation around what you can actually own and what you can't. But I think you need to have someone that's taking the lead on it to make sure that whatever the agencies agree, it does get implemented. But I think with all kind of change management, you have to get buy-in. And it doesn't matter if it's an AI or a process change. You need to get buy-in from the team, and people have to see the value about why you want to change or adopt something. And I think that's where you have to bring them in and understand your reasons why you want to bring that tool in, how it's going to use, and get consensus that everyone is up for using it. Because if they're not, just like with anything, it's not even AI. If it's not fully adopted, it will never get embedded. And I go through this a lot when I'm trying to bring a process change in, is that if I don't bring in key people, and it's not just the most senior, I'm talking about the people on the shop floor, then they won't feel that they've had some kind of ownership for it and they've not had a voice, and then they don't adopt it. And I think it's the same thing, is that if an agency is truly want to adopt a piece of AI, whatever it might be, they've got to ensure that the whole team that they've got is up for using it. They see the benefits, because only that's what gets embedded.
I guess. Sorry, I was going to say, following on from that, I guess one of the issues at the moment for many agencies is that they kind of want to keep AI hidden from clients. I mean, you know, they're not quite ashamed of it, but they don't want to acknowledge it to the client that they are using it in the way that you're talking about agencies should use it. Would that be the case?
Yeah, well, I think they seem to think that the client's paying for a lot more, so they might end up paying for a day, and actually the work's been done in an hour. And this whole thing is a much bigger topic on pricing.
Yes.
And agencies not really truly charging what they're worth as an agency. Yeah, and I think all this does is just amplify that, right? It just amplifies that issue, that agencies don't feel confident in their pricing. And the majority of agencies I go in, the first thing I pick out is that you're not charging enough for what you do. And that was way before we even had AI.
At the upstream
Yeah, at the value end. And now it's got a lot worse because clients now saying, and if a client asks an agency, how are you leveraging AI? What they're basically saying is where there's going to be a cost saving for us. And I think the confident agency is going to say, yeah, well, it's just a tool. We've been using Macs and whatever. Yes, we use that for elements of it, but what you're paying for is our thinking.
Yeah.
And that's not what you're going to get elsewhere. And I think an agency needs to be strong. I know a handful of really top agencies that everyone is like, when you have agencies like the agency's agency, they're not going to fear AI or anything about pricing because they never did in the past. They're like, I don't care what they're charging. You're coming to us. And I know one agency that is very selective on the clients that they work with. And in fact, clients are really chuffed when this agency has accepted them as a client. Can you imagine what an amazing position to be in? I can assure you that agency is not in the least worried about AI.
Or,
Yeah,
or
and they're just
pricing or their value.
very upfront about their
Yeah,
use of it and how they use it.
absolutely. And I think it's just a tool, and I think if agencies go in there and say we're using it, they're degrading what they offer. So what if they use Claude or ChatGPT? And then it's like, well, yeah, okay, we've got a copywriter, but the copywriting, what you're paying for, that skill and that ability of someone to write some perfect copy, that's right kind of tone of voice for your brand and all those things, just because I can use Claude is not going to make me a copywriter.
No. And
Just
we
because
all
I can
know,
get the canvas.
and we all know what's
designing.
out there. Like the client knows what's out there, the agency know what's out there. I've just got a quote. You wrote you and I are sitting on the judging panel for the National Digital Awards, and after the final judging day last Monday, you wrote a lovely LinkedIn post, which if anyone listening and they are not following Manish on LinkedIn, you need to be. And after that session, you wrote, it reminded you of why you loved or enjoyed being in the industry, reminding why you love working in this industry. Just give us a little summary, because I read that post and I did have a tiny little tear in my eye, mainly because I was sitting in the room with you at the time. So I had the same experience.
Well, I think it's when you start to read through all those submissions. Because we realized the best submissions were the ones that were quite full with lots of detail, and they were quite inspiring.
And told
About why people
stories.
have started. Yeah, it was fantastic about why they started their agencies and what they've actually achieved and how they've kind of adapted. And it was very optimistic, and there was no sort of doom and gloom. I think, I can't see anyone to enter an award that had went in with that mindset. Of course, they're going to be quite optimistic, and they were very proud of what they achieved. But they also achieved that in quite a small space of time. We're not talking about agencies that were there for 20 years. Some of them have been going for a year and had phenomenal growth, amazing achievement. And you look at the clients that they landed were household names, for an agency quite small. But what I liked about it was how innovative they were, as far as how they kind of adopted technology, how they work with their clients, the level of agility that they had. But just the way that even though we see agencies as being quite the same, when you really go in deep, and I experience this when I do agency audits, you realize how special some of them actually are. So they might
That's
offer
awesome,
from the
wasn't it?
surface level. Yeah, on the surface level, looking at their website, you might look at it and go, well, they all kind of do the similar type of stuff. And they're not really good about explaining themselves clearly enough on their website and their point of difference. But that's
a whole
another
other
topic.
That's another conversation.
Yeah. And so, but when you actually read through what they did as far as why they established their agency and how they work and what they deliver for their clients, I found that really inspiring. And I realized that actually, as an industry, we've got a lot of innovation there. People are really adaptable and agile in how they work. And I think the barriers have come down, and that's technology does do that. It loosens the barriers. It's not so you need to have such a capex budget to get up and running. And ultimately, it's about what's in your brain and your ability to come up with some great ideas that's going to make the difference between you succeeding and failing. And reading through those submissions and what those agencies achieved in a short space of time, how they leverage technology, had their methodologies, how they work with people was pretty unique. And that's when they all start to look quite different. So we looked at categories, right? So we would have a category that we would looking through the submissions, but we could very clearly define and pick out the ones that we thought were actually really, really good versus the ones that probably weren't so great.
Weren't they?
Absolutely. It's about how they're set up and how they work. And that came through reading through those submissions. I thought it was a great experience. I really enjoyed it.
Manish, thank you so much for your time. It's been a wonderful, wonderful discussion. I suspect you are going to be a very busy guy in the sort of months and years ahead, helping agencies with efficiency and operations. So you're there to help. So if anyone listening wants to get in touch, I mean, Deb's already given you a great plug for your LinkedIn, so seek you out on LinkedIn, but how should they find you?
Yeah, well, they can find me on my website, Manish.Kapur Consulting. Everything's on there. I do write a lot as well. Deb, so as well as the LinkedIn posts, I've also got quite a few articles that I write as well. And I think it's because I don't actually write those until the day or so before. So another one's come out this morning. And I wrote that yesterday. And it's all quite relevant because a lot of my inspiration comes from the agencies I work with. So I'm never short of ideas. I just know that when I'm in these kind of conversations, when I'm talking to people, something will come up and I've got a view on it. And so as well as the LinkedIn stuff that I put out on a regular basis, there's also articles on my website that I'm sure agencies will find pretty useful.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Manish, thank you so much.
We're excited
It's
to
been a pleasure.
have you part of MSQ's future. It's lovely talking to you as always.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to The Space Between, where honest conversations just came to life. Brought to you by MSQ. Visit msqindex.com to learn more. Now, go forth and enter your own space between.